welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking at a concept which is in some ways quite alien to the modern pianistic viewpoint on playing Bach. Rubato can be described as controlled tempo flexibility, and it is employed both as a performance tradition and as an expressive necessity, although those two qualifications are not necessarily equal in terms of value. Perhaps the best-known composer in which wide varieties of rubato are used is Chopin, though Liszt, Brahms, and Debussy present just as many instances where a pianist must think about their tempo flexibility. In composers before Beethoven, the performance tradition we have today encourages a style of playing where the tempo is relatively stable and in some ways mechanized, and in some quarters it is considered something of a taboo to play around with that tempo. Bach represents the absolute end, where dogmatic pedagogy can appear regarding flexibility of any sort, and I'd like to explain not only where and why tempo flexibility can and must be used in Bach, but also why I believe the performance tradition on the modern piano has evolved to be very much on the side against this kind of flexibility as a normal procedure. As I mentioned in another episode dealing with ritardando in Bach, one aesthetic trait of the majority of Bach's keyboard works is that there is a regular rhythmic pattern that doesn't change. A motor is set up, and the musical interest of the piece is hung on that rhythmic framework. There is only one class of pieces which Bach wrote for the keyboard where this is not the case: the toccatas. These are by nature improvisational works, written in a style which is either directly transcribed from an improvisation or written to emulate closely this kind of musical situation. Bach's toccatas tend to begin with a rhythmically open and unstable set of musical gestures, as if Bach is sitting at the keyboard trying ideas out, or even checking to see if the tuning of the instrument is stable throughout the compass. Sometimes, this concept of tuning is a little more blatant. Other times, Bach is really just, for lack of a better word, noodling around the keyboard, taking a single key like C minor and seeing how often he can move towards that key and away from it, in as flashy a manner as possible. But all this is really just to say that the music is not stable or predictable, and the impression the listener has should be one of an unplanned musical journey, where even the composer is not entirely sure where things are going. These toccatas are not only filled with improv material, there are fugues and dances as well. But even these traditionally strict and rigid movements exhibit a surprising lack of structural planning and gestural efficiency. There are general internal rules that Bach follows when he constructs his fugues, for example, but these rules are either ignored or flamboyantly thrown out the window in the toccatas, which makes them even more difficult to perform. In the toccatas, you have to expect the unexpected. This is where rubato comes in. But we're still left with the question of how do we use rubato, and when is it appropriate or beneficial to do so? For the moment, let's consider a piece that is built in a similar style to the Bach toccatas, but has a lower complexity in harmonic language and gesture. The opening of Handel's A major suite offers us all the elements of a Bach toccata opening: improvisation, checking tuning, and a free rhythmic style. The first aspect of rubato that is important to understand in this style of music is that unlike Chopin, where the taking of time is eventually compensated for later on in the bar, rubato in Baroque music in general involves actual time shifting, where it may get slower for a long time, or it may get faster for a short time, and there is no explicit or implied relation between speeding up or slowing down. In other words, in Chopin, there may be an underlying pulse which links the bars together, whereas in Bach and Handel, that is not necessarily the case. The bar length in my opening here is far shorter than later on in the piece, like over here. Furthermore, the freedom exists to either do a traditional Chopin-like rubato, where I speed up and slow down by the same amount, like this, or I can approach this as a continuous accelerando, where we start at one tempo and arrive at another without any consequences. Let's be clear about this. It is one thing to take time and compensate for it within a bar or two, but but it's entirely different if the compensation doesn't realistically occur for pages on end, or if the compensation simply doesn't exist. That is a stylistic difference, and that is something which is important to understand when approaching this kind of music. The next element of rubato to consider here is that it is based solely on gestural and harmonic necessities. Melody doesn't have much to do with it. In Baroque music, cadences are structural and emotional points of interest, and as such, they usually require time. In a free or open improvised situation like this, the time can be exaggerated or expanded based on the complexity of the material. As an example, the opening is relatively simple. But in bar 19, we have harmonic and gestural complexity. It would make sense to take a little more time in bar 19 than in the opening from an harmonic and gestural point of view. Similarly, the structural context is an important factor that can inform us of when to take time and when not to, but we have to use our imagination a bit in order to not sound too cliched. Imagine for a moment that the composer is sitting at a brand new harpsichord for the first time, unsure of what to expect in terms of sound. The composer decides to begin in A major. A scale is an easy way to determine tuning and resonance, so let's add that too. Then the composer might think, okay, enough of that, let's explore some other chords. But I still don't feel comfortable, so I'll play another scale. Now we've set up a pattern of chords. So, why not continue the pattern by going up a tone or two? When we've put it all together, with these thoughts in between, we get an improvised story, which the audience can follow, and which becomes very obvious to them if they happen to know a little bit about harmony. We have to be actors in this moment in order to sell the musical material, because if played strictly as written, the material fails tragically. So far, we've looked at rubato as a semi-permanent acceleration or deceleration, based on gesture, harmony, and structural position. Also, rubato here is used as a signal to the audience that something is unplanned or improvisational. This signal is a more explicit one than the other signals given by the harmonic or gestural components. In a simple piece like the Handel, all of this is rather clear and open to interpretation, and there are many ways that one can play this piece and have it be successful at communicating the content. Let's consider now what happens when we have the same principles applied to a piece that is far more dense in terms of harmonic and gestural complexity. The opening of the E minor toccata gives us musical gestures which serve the same purpose as the block chords in the Handel. We have a central key that is established, gestures which provide patterns for the listener to follow, and overall a simple musical texture which can mimic the situation of improvisation. Harmonically, it's quite simple. We start in E minor, go to the 4th, then 5th, then back to the tonic. This is the most efficient way to definitively establish a key in tonal music. In terms of gesture, we have an ornamented scale, and then this gesture is broken up to help establish the harmony. All of this happens rather quickly from a structural point of view compared with the Handel, and as a result, we can't take nearly as much time as we could before. It has to be subtle. Now, after this gesture has been explored sufficiently, Bach explores the gesture from a different point of view, creating chains of harmonic sequences. Because this is all happening on a shorter time scale than the Handel, we can afford to make a bigger deal of the change in gesture. In other words, we end one gestural pattern here, and we begin another here. Therefore, in between these two sets, we can take a lot of time if we want, as if we're the composer thinking, okay, what do I do next? This kind of temporal stretch doesn't destroy the structure or musical content the way it would in a dance or other traditional work of Bach. In fact, it communicates more of the musical context than if we were to play it straight through rhythmically like this. Played this way, there is no story, no improvisation, and no interest. Before I move on, I should state that there is a lot of subjectivity going on here, and there is plenty of room for disagreement regarding how much time to take and where to take it. As always, I want to stress that I'm not attempting to set rules about interpretation, which must be rigidly followed. My intention is to show avenues which a pianist can explore in their own interpretation, and how far they take these freedoms is up to them entirely. But I will state as a rule that Bach is not a composer in which one must play strictly in time all the time. These pieces cannot function if played that way. Now, this E minor toccata opening can be easily broken down by chords due to the way it's composed and structured, and therefore it's not too difficult to figure out where to take time and where to enjoy the resonance. But let's look at one of the openings where scaling and arpeggiation patterns are prominent. These require a little more careful thought. The opening of the C minor toccata is difficult to comprehend if played as written, in a strict rhythm. There's no real indication of what to do with it, and when played like this, the material doesn't seem very well organized or structured. What we have to do is break it down harmonically and by gesture, to give us clues as to what Bach is actually doing. First, the trill on the C is isolated, both as a gesture and by the sonic rest that follows. This is already a powerful tool, because it focuses the listener on a single note, which happens to be the key that the toccata to follow will be in. Naturally, we could play this trill longer or shorter, depending on how we feel or what effect we want. After the trill, we have our usual scale, but notice that it starts on the fifth of the scale, so that we establish that the C is in fact the tonic. Furthermore, the scale goes up and ornaments the E flat to establish that it is C minor and not C major. This is further reinforced by the large jump to the A flat and then the horrifying drop to the B natural, which is a very rough interval to jump in Baroque music. All of these small gestures serve to say to the audience, C minor. And instead of playing a series of chords, Bach does it all with scales and ornaments. It's only when we understand the purpose of all of these small gestures that we can then determine what to do with tempo and rubato. The C trill at the beginning is already isolated, so we don't have to do much with it. It doesn't establish on its own any form of rhythm or tempo, so in effect it's an isolated incident. The scale afterwards serves to offer a direct contradiction to the lack of motion in the trill. Instead of a single note, we have a moving wave of sound, and the energy within the wave, as represented by our tempo fluctuations, is controlled or contoured by the harmonic content. If played slowly and in parts, we have our first establishment of the key, or 5-1 with a minor content here, then a reinforcement with the A flat and final little cadence here. The reason it cannot be played straight through rhythmically is because there is no other material that we can use to show the audience what is happening harmonically. We don't even have an accompaniment, and therefore the harmony and the melody and the gestures all combine to explain the compositional decisions. Since there is no accompaniment, we really have only two vectors upon which we can vary to communicate energy or lack of energy: dynamics and tempo fluctuations. Dynamics can work, but as you'll hear, they are quite limited because there is only a single line of notes. Tempo fluctuation is the only vector that can be used that has more range than dynamics, and surprisingly, it can actually do more to a gesture than dynamic change can. saying that due to the material and texture, we are forced as pianists to communicate the intricacies of this opening through rubato and tempo change as a primary vector of expression. We've touched on many different areas here, and they may or may not result in general rules which one can apply to every piece. In my past experience, I've found that in general Bach is played with far too little freedom, with harmonic and gestural elements being driven through, not necessarily due to malice, but more likely because pianists simply don't think that they're allowed to take time. Why has our performance tradition evolved to this point? There are many reasons, and I've only just touched on one or two in this episode. There are other issues at stake which must be properly elucidated in order for us to begin to see an answer, but those may have to wait for another episode. For now, know that in the toccatas, it's not only recommended, but it's actually necessary in my view, to give them far more time than we might expect. Temporal freedom is a prerequisite for expression in these pieces. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Keep on making music. Bye for now.